Hi, it's Andrew McIntosh, your host at the PrimateCast. This podcast is a labor of love, sharing stories about primates, other wildlife, and why their conservation matters, through the voices of incredible people who dedicate their lives to this work. Now, the podcast depends on listeners like you. If the PrimateCast has inspired you or taught you anything at all over the years, consider paying it forward by supporting the show. Even a small donation helps keep the show on air. Visit theprimatecast.info or tap the Support the Show link in the show notes. Donating's not your thing? Then leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app to help others find the show and support my mission of sharing these stories far and wide. Thanks for being part of this journey with me. All right, on to the episode. After the tune, comparative cognitive scientist Dr. Nicolas Claidiere on social learning, culture, and conventions, right here on the PrimateCast.
Evolution,
communication,
cognition,
conservation,
behaviour,
primatology,
typically primates. Become the monkey.
Hey everyone, welcome to the PrimateCast. I'm your host, Andrew McIntosh, now of the Wilder Institute, Calgary Zoo. Before we get into the interview I've got lined up today, I have a little bit of podcast housekeeping to do. I want to remind everyone that as I laid out in great detail in my last episode, A Primatologist's Journey from Japan to the Wilder West, this podcast is no longer brought to you by SciCasp and Kyoto University. The PrimateCast is now independent, and as such, I've been asking for your support to help keep the podcast going. I realized that you just heard that in the pre-roll, but I bring it up now because I have the pleasure of thanking our very first set of podcast supporters. A monumental shout out to Cecil, Paula, and Melanie for becoming members of the PrimateCast. Your support means a lot to me, and your contributions are going directly into the running costs of this program, so thanks so much. I've also seen a few new ratings here coming in on apps like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and there's a new review on Apple that reads, "I love the show. So many great episodes, and I use it in my teaching in primatology too." So my thanks to Sarah Makaka for that review. I love that practicing primatologists are using the PrimateCast as an educational tool, either in or outside the classroom. I did that myself from time to time when I was teaching at Kyoto University, but it started to feel a bit like I was asking my students to buy my own textbook. So I used it kind of sparingly. Oh, and not that there's anything wrong with assigning your own textbook if you're doing that. I mean, heck, if you're Karen Stryer teaching primate behavioral ecology, you cannot go wrong with your own textbook. Or maybe you're Joe Setchell assigning your own book studying primates for a course on primatological methods. By all means. I've never even written a textbook, and maybe that means I'm just being sour. But the point is, I'm super thrilled that others find the material I produce here of practical use. And if you're out there and if you've also used the PrimateCast in your teaching, or if you find yourself being assigned or having been assigned the podcast for additional learning in your own classes in primatology, definitely reach out to me and let me know. Really cool. Anyway, thanks again to Cecil, Paula, Melanie, and Sarah for your support. I'm looking forward to making this a staple part of the show's introductory notes. So if you're out there and can make a contribution, I look forward to thanking you in this space as well and sharing your thoughts with the world. Right, so on with the episode. In December of 2023, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Nicolas Claidiere. He's a cognitive scientist at the Center for Research in Psychology and Neuroscience at Aix-Marseille University in France. And I first met Nico many, many years ago at one of the International Primatological Society conferences. But he was in Japan at the end of last year, 2023, with his friend and colleague, Hugo Mercier, they'd never been to Kyoto University's Primate Center, so I invited them for a visit. So we talked briefly about Hugo in the conversation, but I also just wanted to give him a special shout out here and recommend to the listeners that you check out his book, Not Born Yesterday, which argues that humans are not gullible. I know, definitely feels like many of us are many of the time, much of the time, but not so in the traditional sense, and that we've actually evolved pretty strong mechanisms to evaluate information. Where we seemingly go wrong or fail the common sense test is much more about the social dynamics of communication than any innate lack of sophistication in our ability to tell the difference between accurate and inaccurate information, which is pretty interesting. It's a great read, and it's also really relevant to the conversation that I had with Nico, who does comparative research with primates, including humans, on social learning, social cognition, and cultural evolution. We ran out of time during his visit to Japan, so the interview was actually recorded over Zoom. And I want to warn listeners that, especially during the second half of the interview, sometimes the audio quality gets a bit spotty. I don't think it'll make a difference or make the conversation too difficult to follow, but I did want to mention it to set your expectations. But I had a lot of fun with this chat. You'll see that Nico has this kind of easygoing way about him when he talks, and you can really feel his excitement. For example, when he talks about discovering the presence of conventions in a study troupe of baboons that he works with. He talks about designing a totally different experiment for a totally different purpose, and then scratching his head at the results, but then having this aha moment. So conventions, they're really common in human societies. And by convention, I don't mean those gatherings where people in a field or trade get together to share products, inspiring stories, or the latest and greatest in their respective industries, but rather the collective behaviors that allow us to solve these so-called coordination problems. Like when all people traveling by car in the same direction do so on the same side of the road. And if they don't, look out. But we also spend a good deal of time in this chat talking about cultural evolution and its relation to biological evolution. A lot of animal behavior is explained by natural selection, which is one of the main mechanisms of biological evolution that leads to adaptations, which help the animals survive and have lots of babies. But animals are also capable of innovations. These are novel behaviors that appear spontaneously, and then others are able to learn those innovations from one another. And a really interesting question then comes up that whether this type of social learning can build upon itself in the same way that we humans stack innovations one on top of the other, leading to cumulative cultural evolution. A great example of this in humans is Moore's law, which has been generalized to describe the kind of exponential nature of technological innovation and advancement that we see all around us. But as Nico describes, the kind of technological reasoning that would allow other species to stack their socially learned behaviors in this way doesn't really seem to exist, especially when it comes to using tools, which is also a widespread behavior across the animal kingdom. But by no means does this mean that animals are uncultured beasts. Nico and I chat at length about social learning, culture, and the cognitive mechanisms that underlie them in this meandering and good-natured conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So here's my conversation with Dr. Nicolas Claidiere. What I like to do though is start with a little bit of an off the wall question, and I think for you, maybe the one that I came up with is, what is the deal with bloodletting?
What is the deal with bloodletting? That's a very interesting way to start.
Yeah, so tell me about bloodletting. What is it, and what's your involvement in it?
So that study was done with Hugo Mercier, who is a very close friend of mine, who's working at Jean Nico in Paris, and the idea was to think about factors that would influence cultural evolution and that were not adaptative, in the sense that you wouldn't get behavior that were adaptative for people, that would improve their welfare, their life, and so on and so forth. And Hugo came with this idea of bloodletting. So this practice that seems to be very intuitive in a sense. So if you feel sick, you have this sort of intuitive theory that you have some bad blood, or that you have something that is wrong within you. And the idea to let the blood flow out is sort of intuitive. And it's also very shocking because you see blood coming out of people and so on and so forth. And we realized that this was one possible explanation for why bloodletting was widely used all over the place, in different places in the world. And so we're starting doing studies on how people would remember stories of bloodletting following the work of Bartlett on memory. And we realized that this was a very important factor. So when you people have a tendency to memorize and remember better stories with bloodletting than stories without. And that could be a contributing factor explaining why bloodletting has evolved and spread in so many places in the world. But that was completely off track. That was one idea that came from Hugo, really. It was like, oh my God, I've got an idea. And that was really funny. And of course, bloodletting is it's not adaptive at all, because when you're sick, the last thing you want is to lose blood. So people were doing this, and they were in fact making people even worse. But that continues. That's still ongoing, apparently.
Yeah, and from what I understand about it, maybe you can mention too, Hugo and Nico, you were both in Japan not that long ago, and we had the chance to hang out for dinner. And both of you gave talks to the graduate program here at Kyoto University. And Hugo's was about the book writing. It was a science communication talk, but in one of his books, Not Born Yesterday, he talks about this bloodletting. So I made a point of reading that. And I find there's a couple of things interesting, and maybe a couple of ways we can transition from bloodletting into your line of research. But one thing I'm interested in is that idea that it's counterintuitive, it spreads really well. And I think that the fact that it's counterintuitive seems to be a really key point about why it's interesting to study, right? So it's kind of like when you're interested in why people perform certain behaviors, behaviors that have like a really clear advantage to us seem to make a lot of sense, right? And especially if we want to extend it to think about how other species behave in natural environments. If there are things that have a real advantage to them, make them survive better or have more babies, then those are things that can evolve by natural selection. But then the more kind of potentially even damaging behaviors like bloodletting, which I imagine would be a damaging behavior to a wild animal at some point, can still spread, at least in humans, because of certain mechanisms that we have, probably related to how much we like to copy each other. So I wonder if you can maybe comment on that. Like, why is it being kind of maladaptive or like a potentially damaging behavior and counterintuitive an interesting thing to study?
So I think you're right. Part of the interest for me in studying bloodletting was this aspect about cultural evolution. So there are two ways in which you can get adaptive behavior in humans and also in certain other species, is through biological evolution, of course, but also through social learning and cultural evolution. And if you look at the way in which cultural evolution works, when you transmit behaviors between individuals over generations, then very quickly it's going to converge towards intuitive biases. So if you're biased towards something like, if you prefer, I don't know, red over blue, or slightly a bit more red than blue, then progressively, because you're transmitting this bias, is going to accumulate, and then people are going to change and go for red all the time. So the small biases are going to accumulate over time. And so the question is, when it's counterintuitive, and it goes against your expectations, is trying to explain how cultural evolution can work in cases when it goes against what you would naturally or spontaneously do. And that's something that we've been working a lot with Hugo on, especially in the case of reasoning problems. So sometimes you can ask simple problems to people and they have a very intuitive answer, but that is wrong. And then you're trying to describe how they can change their response based on the information that they get from other people. So you can explain how cultural evolution works when it becomes counterintuitive. And the idea, the general idea behind this is to go even beyond that. So if you think about technological evolution, for instance, that changes all the time. And we are very far now from where we were like just, a few, even 100 years ago. And the question is, how do we maintain this constant influx of new technologies going against our sort of natural and spontaneous behaviors? We are adapting all the time. And that's a big part of cultural evolution. And that's something that is quite difficult to study and to understand in humans in particular.
Yeah, so we had Andrew Whiten give a lecture for us a couple of years ago now at a symposium we ran and for PsyCast for our international kind of lecture series. And one of the questions I asked him, because he was so important in this development of understanding culture in animal societies, and one of the questions that I asked is related to the fact that in the earlier days, I guess, and you could say maybe the 90s is when, I could be wrong, but I think when most of this started to late 90s, early 2000s, when most of this, from a comparative perspective, started to converge. And a lot of that was based on this chimpanzee study of, multiple sites and these different behaviors that they perform. But at the time, it was really important to be able to show how variation behavior couldn't be linked to something clear in the environment, right? Like it had to be something that's almost irrelevant, right, to the kind of survival or fitness of the animal. And I wonder if his answer to that question was obviously in the beginning, that might be true because we have to be able to demonstrate this is not clearly linked to something that could be a simpler explanation for it, like an evolved behavior. But now it seems to be much more accepted, that there are cultural differences and there is social learning, and animals can kind of diverge in that way. And then that can still affect fitness, right? So, yeah, so I wonder if maybe that's a good way to go into thinking about cultural evolution as well. And maybe it would be nice if you kind of defined that and maybe talked about its relationship to natural selection. So the regular way we think about evolution happening.
No, I agree with Andy. So at the beginning, because everybody was skeptical about the idea of cultural evolution and social learning in non-human primates, but in animals in general, people had to come up with very clear demonstration of cases where you couldn't possibly argue for anything else, like biological evolution or simply individual learning. So in many cases, people were saying, if you find a nice new technique to open a nut using a stone, maybe individuals are learning that on their own without any form of social transmission and social learning. So people had to come up with very clear examples that were very on one extreme of the continuum. But of course, cultural evolution. So if we define cultural evolution as the fact that behaviors, artifacts are transmitted between individuals through social learning, so that these are behaviors that you learn from other individuals, then it becomes clear that there is a mix of factors that can intervene in social learning. There is a bit of individual learning. So think about, I don't know, I'm going to take a simple example, for instance. Think about learning to cycle, okay? So we know that cycling, it's something that is very cultural, obviously. You learn that from a bit of your parents and your friends, and, you have a lot of social context, but there is also a lot of individual learning. You need to, learn to balance and to to get the right kind of equilibrium and to turn and so on and so forth. So there's a mix of factors. There is genetic disposition, there is individual learning, and there is social learning. And it's a combination of all that makes it possible for cultural evolution to go on. But the more important is the social learning part. The clearer is the cultural aspect of the behavior or the artifact that you're looking at. So if you take a computer, it's very clear. Now, if you take something like say, for instance, nut cracking, or, in chimpanzees, there's a bit of individual learning and there's a bit of social transmission. So it's sort of shaping the behavior and giving a bit of a push from the social learning side. And then you get this sort of transmission across generations. So you get the whole spectrum from purely individual learning to very strongly social learning.
I think I also asked Andy in that presentation if he had some examples from animals in the wild of, let's say, cases where we see this kind of culture potentially even impacting fitness. But I think you've also you've looked at the interface or the feedbacks between potentially cultural and biological evolution. So do you have any maybe examples from other species about where that would be happening and how we should think about it?
Right. So, for instance, there was if we think, in many cases, it's going to impact fitness, because in many cases that we know of, there's food involved and there's extracting resources. So the nut cracking in chimpanzees, obviously they're getting than not. So that's very important. There are examples, for instance, of rats in Israel doing social learning, and they are learning to use a particular technique to get the seeds of pine cones, for instance. That's also very obviously very important for their survival. And when they don't have this technique, it takes them like hours to get the seeds, and when they have the technique, it takes them like a minute when they get the seeds. So these are very clear cases where there is a big impact on biological evolution. But the question is, I think, so as long as we are focused on behavior that do not evolve over time, so in many cases in animal cultural evolution, there is no evolution to speak of. So you're simply learning a behavior, say nut cracking, but it's this behavior versus nothing. It's not like you're learning several steps of nut cracking and you're getting better and better, or using different hammers, or improving the technique. It's either one or nothing. In human evolution, the interaction between biological evolution and cultural evolution is more complex because there is cultural evolution. And then the problem becomes, through cultural evolution, you can sort of flatten biological evolution, because you can learn new behaviors that are going to be adaptive and that are going to release the selection pressure on biological evolution. And that makes a huge difference. So the interaction between biological evolution and cultural evolution is very important in humans, but it's less clear in non-human animals.
Yeah, so that's exactly where I wanted to go with it, because I know you've spent a fair amount of time thinking and writing about accumulation of cultures. And I think if we look around us, anywhere you are listening to this, you can see massive examples of it in human societies, from the places we live in, the clothes we wear, the technologies we use. I mean, almost everything. I was having a discussion recently about, I think it was related to like this idea of long-termism, but basically, if we suddenly were thrust into a post-apocalyptic situation, it would take forever to get back to the place where we are now, because there's so much knowledge, I mean, fundamental knowledge, that's just kind of locked up in some time period in our history. And it's really hard to go back to kind of fundamentals or first principles and start building the things that we have already. So it's very clear, as you said, how our kind of cultural evolution and technological evolution kind of would flatten the biological part of it. But are there any kind of examples of this in other species where there is a kind of clear building of different kind of socially learned behaviors upon one another in a way that would kind of matter?
I think so. I like the question, but yeah, in a way that would kind of matter is very important. So I mean, people have been looking very hard to try to find cases where you get accumulation of cultural evolution, and people were so excited. So there are a few examples. There is one, for instance, that I like from Dora Biro, studying pigeons and pigeons flying from point A to B. And if you take completely naive pigeons, they are going to look all over the place to go from A to B. And then progressively, she makes transmission chains. So pigeons are flying with a friend, and then the friend is flying with another friend, and so on and so forth, a bit like a Chinese telephone game. And what she says is that progressively, the pigeons are finding the route that is the quickest, the most straightforward between point A and B. So again, I mean, if you think about it, in natural environment, you could imagine that this has an impact because they're gaining energy flying from A to B. If they have to do this all the time, then it's faster, right? So it kind of matters, but it's nothing like technological evolution. I think everybody agrees. I mean, there is no evidence that there is anything, especially using tools or things like this, that even resembles cultural evolution, technological evolution in humans. And that's a big problem, and people have been arguing a lot about it. Some people think that this is linked to our social learning capacity, that we are very good social learners, and that we can copy any kind of behavior, we can imitate many different things. And that this capacity is the reason why we get technological evolution Other peoples like me and François Uriac, for instance, in Lyon, I've been trying to argue that the main reason, or at least one very important factor, is that we are very good with tools and technologies to start with, and that we've evolved, like biologically evolved technological reasoning capacity. So we understand cause and effects, and the different properties and physics of technology, and that's the main reason why we get technological evolution. And I think the jury is still out there somewhere, But it's, so to be clear, I mean, it's a combination of the two things. You need social learning and you need technological reasoning to get technological evolution. The question is what evolved first and what is the most important. Yeah,
there's a few different ways that we can go with this, but I am interested to maybe pursue the tools a little bit in non-human. So one thing that's been interesting, and I can't say I followed it that closely, but this school of primate archaeology. And so maybe part of that is based on the fact that there is a material culture. So in great apes, in chimpanzees, most spectacularly, I suppose, where even in the wild, they're shown to use not only all kinds of tools, but also tool sets, where they use different kinds of tools in the same sequence in order to access different types of resources. And unfortunately, things like sticks, which would be their main tools, don't preserve in like an archaeological record in any way. But I suppose there's the possibility that you have progressive improvements in the way those animals are using those sticks to access resources. So that could be one possibility. And across the communities, or across Africa, the extent to which different chimpanzee communities use tools is also quite different. So one hypothesis could be that's just like different kind of stages of this. I don't know if it would be a cultural evolution of using things like sticks. You could maybe comment on that.
So the tricky part is to show the fact that there is improvement in using tools is fine. So I mean, you can find that they're getting better because they're using. So for instance, they sort of making brushes at the end of sticks to pick up termites. They are doing several modifications of tools. Okay. And you find this in other species as well. So New Caledonian crows are going to do several steps and modify things several times in order to fish for larvae, for instance. And you can also find this in capuchin monkeys. I mean, capuchin monkeys have an impressive repertoire of tool use, stick use, and so on and so forth. But the tricky part is to show that this improvement is transmitted. It is socially learned. You need to socially learn the improvement. And that's where everybody's stuck. So there has been a few experimental studies. I'm thinking of Dean and colleagues some time ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago. I think it was 2012. And they were doing a study where you could open a box and, you could do several modifications, and that would bring you more and more rewards, more higher value rewards. And what they found was that chimpanzees were attracted to the box. So there was this kind of social attraction to the box, and they would manipulate the box. But each individual would learn independently to open the different stages of the box. So the modifications happen. There is no doubt about it. So the chimps are getting better, and they're finding more complex behavior, more efficient behavior. But as far as we know, they don't seem to be able to socially learn the modifications of the behavior. And that's where the technological evolution begins.
The second part of that I was really curious about, and of course I have some background. I mean, we talk about this in my some of the classes that I teach as well, but it seems that it's not at all clear how much of the how much understanding some of these animals have of how the tools actually work. And so it's all good enough to be able to socially learn a behavior that uses a tool, but whether or not the animal actually understands its maybe its function, but actually how it actually achieves that function. So there were some clever experiments, I think, with capuchins that show they don't seem to understand why the tools that they're using work. If you kind of change the apparatus so that they end up losing a nut based on which direction they're pulling through a tube. So it seems like there's some bits of information there that are missing. And I know that you've done a little bit of work on technological reasoning as well. And so I assume this kind of causal relationship between the tool that they're using and the function or the outcome that they get is. So where are we at on that now? Like, do you think that the chimpanzees or New Caledonian crows, I mean, is it still that we're unsure whether they actually understand why something like that works, or have we gotten past that already?
I think it's a very tough question, trying to know if an animal understands what she's doing.
In humans as well, right? Because a lot of times we do things and have no idea why it works.
One interesting way, I think, to approach the problem, and one that we've been using, but mostly with humans, in the case of technological reasoning, is to try to have individuals solve the problem when you do small modifications. Okay, and the question is, if you understand how it works, really, if you change something, then people and non-human animals are supposed to adapt their behavior to the changes that you've done, and some of the changes can be completely irrelevant, in which case it shouldn't change anything. Some of them should be relevant. In that case, you expect individuals to adapt in a certain way. And I think in New Caledonian crows, for instance, there has been many studies showing that I wouldn't interpret it as they understand what they're doing. So if you change something, they're going to change their behavior. I mean, maybe they're going to try once, but then they're going to adapt very quickly and find a different solution to solve the problem. Now, I mean, with my experience in non-human primates, it's not so clear. It seems that as soon as you change something, it's going to take them a long time to adapt to the new conditions. I mean, we've been seeing that repeatedly in many different kinds of experiments. And it seems like it takes a really, really long time. It's not this kind of intuitive perception of what's going on and adaptation to new conditions. They do the same thing, it doesn't work, they do it 10 times, and then they start changing, thinking, I don't know what they're thinking, but they start, exploring new behaviors to try to find a solution to a problem. So it seems to be very, very different. And I think one aspect of human technological evolution is this capacity to understand cause and effects and how it works. And that's very powerful for us to build new technologies. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I know, like, a lot of these are kind of hard concepts, and I've seen there's a lot of debate, even going back to the origins of social learning studies, like all of the different, I always got put off a little bit by all of the different definitions and how careful people are about defining what it means to copy, and it seemed to be so many different variations on that theme. But I want to transition a little bit, because you just started talking about your own experience, and a lot of that, at least for sure in the last 10 years and more than that, has been with baboons. And I wonder if you could answer for me, why are baboons a good model for studying social cognition?
So we study Guinea baboons, and I've become quite fond of them. I think they're very interesting for social learning experiments and social cognition in general, because they have a sort of very complex hierarchical social structure. So they form, this is beautiful work by Julia Fischer at the DPZ in Germany. And she showed that they have one male units. So you have usually one big male with several females and kids around. And these one male units are forming bigger units, like 5, 6 of them. And then they form even bigger units with a lot of different gangs getting together, up to 200 or 300 individuals in the wild. And so they have this sort of complex hierarchical structure. But the Guinea baboons also have horizontal transfers between units. So the females are going to move from different males. And males are also forming coalitions. So there is a lot of social dynamics compared to some other species of baboons or the non-human primates. And there is a very interesting social dynamics and complex social relationships. I think that's one of the reasons why baboons have been the object of studies, dating back to the 80s, the work by Dunbar and Whiten and Byrne and so on and so forth, trying to study human evolution and thinking that baboons were a good model of human evolution, because they have this complex social structure that is also a bit flexible, and that's very interesting to understand, I think, human social evolution.
Yeah, that's right. Even decades before that, people studying wild baboons as a model for human evolution because they assume they occupy similar ecological niches, right, in the kind of savannas, forest savanna transitions in Africa. So they do have like a very special place, I think, in the history of primatology. But I don't necessarily see that many labs investigating cognition in baboons. And so are there sorry?
I think we're the only one.
You're the only, okay, I was going to confirm that. Like, do you have any colleagues out there?
Well, I mean, again, Julia Fisher is doing some very interesting work with baboons in Senegal. And she's also interested in cognitive evolution, for sure. But the sort of experiment that we do with touch screens and everything, I mean, we are the only lab using this with baboons. Yeah.
So can you maybe like describe how that place got started? So I believe that this was, if I'm not wrong, was started by Joël Fagot.
It was started. So Joël has been developing systems to study non-human primates sort of more or less automatically. So at the beginning it was joysticks on a computer, and then progressively moved to touchscreens. And in 2008, he opened this amazing place in close to Marseille in France, where you have a group of baboons and they can freely go into this sort of little testing cubicles where you have a touchscreen and the baboons are recognized by the computer. They can go there whenever they want. It's completely free. And they're recognized by the computer and you can perform experiments on a touchscreen. And when Joël opened this in 2008, it was the only one who was being able to have this sort of free-ranging group of baboons interacting with the computers. And since then, a few teams have started using this system. But it's proved very, very successful and very interesting because there are a lot of constraints that are just disappear with the system. So often, when you're studying non-human primates in the lab, you have testing sessions. So, twice a day, say between 10 and 12 and 2 and 4 usually, you're either taking the monkey and bringing them to a testing chamber, or you're asking them to come over. So you're in your testing lab and you're asking the monkeys, can you come, please do an experiment for me? And they come and they go when they want, if they want. So that's one way of doing it. And it's very time consuming and it's very effortful and difficult. And Joël's lab is completely different because the baboons can go whenever they want. And therefore, what you realize is that they're going to go maybe for 1 hour, 2 hours a day. They get a small food reward every time they do something, a correct response. And they are going to come and go all day long. They come maybe for 1 minute and then they leave. They come maybe for 5 minutes and then they leave. But that's very natural. That's very spontaneous. That's what you observe in the wild. They're walking around and then they start foraging for a bit and then they move on to something else. So when you think about the way in which we are doing research in the traditional way, when you're taking the monkeys for like 10 minutes or 15 minutes, it's way too long. I mean, they want to do something else. So they're going to pay attention for a very short amount of time. And then you put them back in the group and you can't test them again. And they want to come back, but it's gone. I mean, the opportunity is gone. So I think a lot of the difficulties we have in a traditional way of conducting experiments are linked to that, to the fact that the way in which we're doing them is not adapted to the sort of natural, spontaneous behavior of the non-human primates.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So just a brief kind of trip back to the joystick there. So this is maybe something you've spoken with him about, but like how tricky is it to get a baboon to use a joystick and for what purpose?
You'll have to ask Joël because I have no idea.
I know that we have the guy that I started this podcast with, Chris Martin, working now at Indianapolis Zoo. He's trained his orangutans there, not his orangutans, the orangutans that inhabit the zoo, how to play some touchscreen based games that they can then play with zoo visitors as well. So like Pong, for example, where a ball is passing between, and that's kind of interesting. So obviously there's ways to get the animals to perform the behaviors for rewards. And once they understand what the task is. But how then have you, or maybe you can comment on like, if the animals are only coming potentially for a minute, I mean, how does that affect how you design the experiments for them to do? Because I imagine, a lot of the time is thinking about if you have an animal in for a session, then it's a little bit easier to design that experiment, even if the animal's not as motivated to do it. But if there's the chance that they only come for like a few seconds at a time, or as up to like, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes, how does that affect how you actually design the tasks?
So it makes a big difference. So you have to think about experiments in terms of very short trials, and we're usually between 5 and 10 seconds. So we don't do like minute-long things because they're not going to stay for 1 minute in many cases. So it's very short trials where you're asking them a sort of very simple question. Can you memorize this? Can you detect a difference? Can you respond based on what the other individual has just done, and things like this? But that's right. So if you think, so a lot of the experiments in humans, because we're doing comparative work, so we're also studying humans and children, and a lot of the studies in humans and children are based on like, I don't know, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, trying to do the same task over and over again, like learning to discriminate between colors or something. And we can't do that with baboons. So you have to think of much shorter trials, just one tiny question that they can do in like 5 or 10 seconds. And then the big advantage is that we are going to get thousands of trials. Okay, so what you do is you're cutting the long experiment into a shorter session, and then you're asking the question repeatedly. And literally, our baboons are doing, on average, close to 1,000 trials a day per individual. So, I mean, you can ask them a lot of these tiny questions.
It's incredible. I was reading an abstract for one of your papers from a while ago about, it's going back to the cultural evolution part, but it was like, here using nearly 500,000 experimental trials performed by a group of, I mean, you don't usually see things like 500,000 data points in primatology or just anyway, animal cognition studies. So in that sense, it really is remarkable, isn't it?
It is. I think it's amazing. I was completely blown away. So the first time I visited Joel's lab, I was just amazed by what we could do. So many ideas, but that was this paper is the outcome of this meeting. I came to the lab for Alpha Day. I was giving a seminar, and I visited the lab, and I came out of it saying, "Look, I mean, we have to do this experiment. I have this experiment on cultural transmission. This is the only place I can do it. I would never dream of doing this in my lab because." It takes so much time to train the monkeys to do stuff, but here it's finally possible. We can do amazing stuff. And that's right. We did this experiment several times over the years, and we realized at some point that we had 500,000 trials of this memory task.
Well, I think you have to explain the task now, just for people to have a perspective. Yeah.
So it's a very easy task. So we were talking about short trials, and what happens is you have to memorize the position. It's a sort of memory game. You have 4 squares that are red in a grid of 16. So it's a 4x4 grid. All the squares are white except 4 of them that are red, and they appear and disappear. And then you just have to touch the square that were red previously. Okay, so it's like finding the cards in the memory game. And the baboons learned to do that. It took us a month to train them to learn to do this. So we have very progressive stages. They first have to remember the position of 1 square, and then 2 squares, and then 3 squares, and then finally 4 squares. But once they've learned that, it's a very easy task. They like it. It's fine. I mean, it's funny, and the squares are always in a different place. They're random positions. So they learned to do that, and they love doing it. And so we managed to get them to do that for several sessions in different experiments, and then we had this huge number of random trials. And what comes with this huge number of trials is that you can look at things in a very detailed way. So what I find is that you often get main effects of an experiment. So in that case, what we wanted to see was what kind of shape they would memorize better. And then what we can study that is very difficult to study in other labs where you have less, a smaller amount of trials, is sort of secondary effects. So we realize in some experiment that you have an effect of the presence of another individual. So if you're alone, you're behaving slightly differently from when you're next to another baboon. And that depends on the status of the baboon. If it's dominant or not dominant, is going to affect your own behavior. And looking at this is only possible when you have a huge number of trials, because you become very, very precise at estimating reaction times or the amount of correct responses and so on. And because you become very, very precise, you can start describing very small effects that are secondary to your experiment, but that are still there and exist.
That's fascinating. And I imagine there's both advantages and disadvantages of that. So, I mean, I just wonder if you researchers are ever out there at the window, like, oh, this, we need this baboon to do some trials today, but then there's like another dominant individual right there, and you're thinking, no, don't get closer because it's going to mess up the. So you can't control that social dynamic, right? And the benefit of having so many different trials is you can eventually control for those kind of compounds, I guess. But the advantages are also you get. I think when you were here in Japan, you were talking about how you can recreate to a high fidelity the social networks of the animals as well. And so what are the kind of other, not even related to the cognitive studies that you're doing, but what are the kind of other data that you can get from this kind of a system?
So we started realizing, so you're right. I mean, one of the difficulty or main limitation of the system is that you can't control what the baboons are doing. So literally they do what they want. So you have to make them interested in your experiment. You want them to come to your experiment. And then,
by the way, I have a funny story about that. Baboons doing what they want. I was in northern Ghana during my master's degree research, and I visited this national park area called Mole, and they have a little tourist, like a hotel resort place that I was staying at. And there was a pool or kind of a deck area with a bunch of tables. And then the local baboons would roll through pretty much daily. And one got up on a table, really scared the tourists away, grabbed one of the glass bottles of Coca-Cola and started sipping out of the straw. So I imagine when baboons have the free right of way to do whatever they want, it can get a little funny. But I'm sorry for interrupting your story.
No, it's a funny story. But that's right. Because they're doing what they want, then we can't impose. I mean, we even have to make experiments that are attractive to them. So if you think about the memory that I was describing, then after a while, they're just bored doing the same thing. So after 3 weeks, 4 weeks, doing this memory task, they're just bored by it. And then they are going to stop doing the experiments because they're afraid to do whatever they want. And therefore, what happens is we have to renew and change the experiment, because otherwise they just stop coming. They just stop doing experiments. So that's one of the main limitations. And I forgot the rest of your question.
I think we were talking about the advantages. So what were the other kind of bits of information that you can pull out of doing these cognitive experiments? Yes. But having all of the animals are I imagine they're chipped, so they have wearable tech. So you could track movements, you could track interactions, and then you can track when they're using the machines and who with, and things like that.
That's right. Yeah. So yes, I mean, so we realized because of this spontaneous dynamics, one of the advantage of the system is that you can actually know where the individuals are and when they're coming to do experiments. And based on that, you can extract information from the group. So we realized very early on, when I started working at the lab, that we start studying social network, because baboons behave as a group. I mean, they behave like in their natural environment. So their behavior is synchronous. So when one individual starts going to the testing cubicles, then it is going to attract other individuals. So they go in a group and with their close friends. So you can look at who is coming next to whom at what time, and then you can reconstruct the social network. And we've been doing this by looking at, having people looking at the behavior of baboons and who's grooming whom. And you realize that based on the grooming network, you realize that you can get the same network using the computers. at the same time, we also looked at when an individual is doing an experiment and gets replaced by another one very, very soon, in 30 seconds. So that's a displacement, and that's something that is typical of a sort of agonistic interaction, dominance interaction, one individual coming to replace another individual in a spot. And looking at this, you can reconstruct the dominance hierarchy of the baboons. So that means that the baboons are using this system. This system is part of their environment. I'm going to say natural environment. It's a natural fake environment, but it's part of it's their place. It's their house. It's where they go every day for a few hours to gain some food and do some experiments. And again, we're starting a new PhD project on curiosity, and I'm very excited about it because I think a large part of why they're coming, they're interested in the experiments, and they want, to have this experience and these cognitive tasks and cognitive challenges that are stimulating in a captive environment.
Yeah, do you see a lot of variation in, I mean, I guess you must. You have a lot of individuals, so there should be a lot of variation in who's using the tasks. And
yeah, so we have 23 individuals, but it's somewhere between 20 and 25, and some individuals are some are not. Dominant males are not interested in experiments. Not very surprisingly, they're following the groups and looking at the females and so on.
That's right.
And you get a lot of variation with age as well. So you have a sort of peak adolescence crisis where individuals are very keen to come and do experiments. But we get individuals from all age ranges. But they come more or less. It's also very dependent on their social position, because that also gives them access to more interesting food or not. So they tend to adjust based on that. So there is a lot of variation. But when we do an experiment for long enough, I would say about a month, you realize that you get all the individuals to come and do the experiment. Even the dominant males would do like, I don't know, one trial a day, maybe two. To 1,000 for their neighbor, but after some time, they come in and they do some, and so we get everybody, and we also get everybody next to everybody else. So even though there is this social structure, they have their close friend and they have the individual they're quite far from. After some time, we get every pair, every combination of individuals coming next to each other in different testing cubicles. So that means that it's also very flexible. I mean, it's not like a very strong repulsion for individuals. They like each other, they just tend not to be next to each other, but it's not a very strong repulsion.
When you were here in Japan, it's about a month ago now, I guess, you gave a talk about, I guess in a way, it was kind of an unconventional study, because I don't think that word unconventional might be relevant to the topic, but it was unconventional in the sense that I think you started, if I'm not wrong, you started trying to test something else that didn't work, but then the result was something potentially even more interesting, which was the finding that there may be conventions in the baboons there. So can you talk about that?
Yes. I mean, for me, it was a very exciting moment, because there's, you're very happy in science when you discover something and you're like, wow, this is exciting. And you have to keep an open mind. And that's what I'm trying to do. And so we really wanted to do an experiment on imitation because of this social learning literature. I wanted to check if the baboons could imitate each other. So I gave them a task where you have two baboons and they're very close to each other and they can see each other's screen. And you present two colors, say blue and yellow, to one baboon, and the baboon can pick whatever she wants. And then the two colors appear on the name screen, and the other baboon has to choose the same color as the first one to be rewarded. So the first baboon chooses yellow, and the other one chooses yellow. They both get a reward at the same time, and they choose the same color, then they're not rewarded. And my idea was that they were going to look at what the other individual is doing. So the second one, the chooser would just look at what the other individual is doing and choose a color based on what the first one was doing. But at the end of the experiment, we used an opaque partition that we slided in between the two baboons, so they couldn't see each other anymore. And we realized that they were as good as, some of them even better, than with the transparent partition when they could see each other. So obviously it wasn't anything linked to imitation or looking at the other individual. And we realized that they had developed this sort of systematic behaviors to allow them to choose a different color. So for instance, they would choose yellow over all the other colors. So yellow over blue, yellow over purple, and so on and so forth. Blue, for instance, was the least chosen color, so it was almost never chosen, and so on and so forth. So they organize the color in a form of structure that allowed them to solve the task. And that is very typical of conventions, and we did several experiments to show that it was similar to human conventions. But I think there was this incredible moment where you realize it didn't work as planned. You're not studying the thing that you were supposed to do. They found something more interesting in your experiment that you didn't think about, and it was very exciting to study and to work out what was going on. How did they manage to solve this task? At the beginning, I didn't understand what was going on, and it was a sort of eureka moment when you now I understand what's going on. So that was a very interesting moment. I think it's one of the things that we live for as scientists, to discover new things that you don't expect. That was one of them. Yeah.
So, I mean, why do you think? So maybe you presumably did these experiments or repeated them, but yellow, you said, was kind of this dominant color, or that came out. Do you have any idea what is it that would bias them in that way for this case? So maybe I'll throw out an example. I don't know, you can tell me if this is also a convention or not, but humans, when we're ordering things, we tend to order things, and especially maybe this is true of people who have writing systems that move from left to right, but we tend to order things from left to right. In Japan, where I'm based, there may be some variations because the traditional way to write is from the top to bottom and right to left. And so there may be ways of ordering things based on that. But it seems to be pretty universal that we kind of order things from left to right and top down. And then some of my colleagues here in Kyoto University showed with the chimpanzees that they also seem to order things from left to right and top down, especially when it comes to like hierarchies too. So they had some clever experiments where they either matched the expectations of the subject or mismatched them by putting a dominant individual on top of a subordinate individual on a screen, right? And then they had to like match some image. It was just a matching task. And then they showed that was fine when they reversed it. So the subordinate was on top and the dominant was on the bottom. The chimpanzees were slower at matching. And so it seems to be a violation of the expectation of like dominance individuals should be on the top. And so but I don't know. So if we number things or order things in a list from left to right, that I guess would be an example of a convention that maybe we share it, though. If we share it with other species that are not humans, I'm not sure it satisfies convention anymore, because it might be something more fundamental. But
right. So the conventions are based on a coordination problem. So the very typical example is driving on the right hand side of the road or the left. And it's a coordination problem, because if you're driving on the left when everybody is driving on the right, you have a problem. So for instance, in writing system, you have a coordination problem because everybody needs to write in the same direction in order to solve the task. But if we are talking about ordering books on your bookshelves, then it's not a coordination problem anymore. It just depends on what you prefer. So there's this sort of subtle change between coordination to individual sort of preferences. Of course, some preferences are more or less universal. They could be based on lots of different things. The fact that you're right-handed, or many people are right-handed, versus left-handed, it could have an impact in your writing system, and that could have an impact on the way in which you order things, and so on and so forth. But in the case of the baboons, why yellow was chosen, I think, is not a very... I have a very banal and not interesting explanation. So in our system, we use red as a sign that is linked to reward. So it's often a target that you have to touch to solve the task. And green is used as a feedback, negative feedback, saying you missed the task. So I think they simply went for the thing that was closest to red. So we got orange and yellow on top and blue at the bottom, which makes a lot of sense when you think about the environment and the way in which they've been using these computers. So I don't think there might be something that is, generally shared with baboons about, or non-human primates about red or something like this, but we can't say anything about it in our setup.
I see.
But more generally, in conventions, they're influenced by individual preferences. Solving this coordination problem is going to rely on sort of intuitive ideas that people have on how to solve them. So if you think about a simple coordination problem, you need to set up a meeting with someone. You're in a city. Suppose you don't have cell phone. Back in the old days when we were very, very young, you need to find a place where you're going to meet that person. The first idea that comes to mind will be the center of the city, the church, whatever, the temple, something that is very clear. And you can meet that person there because you're thinking that she's thinking that, So you're going to solve that coordination problem based on your intuitions. So what I'm saying is that conventions can be based on intuitions because they are going to be based on this solving these coordination problems, but they can also go against. So you can also set up a convention that is against your intuitions, and then once it's set up, it's very hard to change because everybody is solving the coordination problem in the same way. Therefore, changing it, think about driving. If you want to, force the UK to change their driving practice to the right side as it should be, then it's gonna be tough. That's it.
I was wondering, and I didn't think of it when you were presenting, but I did ask that question about the colors. But had you considered replicating with different kinds of stimuli? So what if you used symbols, for example? I mean, would you expect a similar kind of result, this emergence of conventions?
That's right. So at the beginning, we were thinking that, we weren't sure it was linked to colors or so we replicated it with black and white shapes of the different shapes, and with different, around 10 with different stimuli every time, and we always get the same result. That's because we have a very clear understanding of what's going on and how they solve this problem. They get a reward when they manage to solve the task, and that's going to reinforce their previous choice. So it makes a lot of sense. We know how they solve the coordination problem and where we get the results. But you're right. I mean, at the beginning, your sort of intuitions about what the other choose is going to influence the outcome of the study. That's for sure. Yeah.
Are there now other examples of this, of conventions in other species, in other situations or conditions?
I think that's one outcome of the paper. There are very few examples of conventions in the wild. I think one study by Susan Perry and conventions in white-faced monkeys is probably the most well-known and emblematic study about in the wild. So we know there are some examples, but I think given that it was very spontaneous in our setup, they came up with these conventions very easily, very quickly, and they're not based on very complex thinking. You can explain them in sort of simple reinforcement level. You don't need to have ideas about what the other individual is thinking, so you don't have theory of mind like this. So we expect conventions to be very widespread. I think they just understudied. I think one outcome of the study is that should be everywhere. But I don't think people have tried to study them very thoroughly. But if we do, my expectation is they're going to be everywhere.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It seems so often that we make these discoveries that just show how potentially unremarkable the behaviors are, or at least the kind of root of the behavior seems to be something so simple that we hadn't considered before, which means, of course, other species are going to have it. So it'll be really interesting to see as we go there. So I think we can start to kind of wind this conversation down a little bit. But before we do that, I have some questions that I was given by an old acquaintance of yours, potentially from
Cool.
Melanie Duval. I asked, and she provided me a few questions that I'm going to throw at you here.
Okay.
Someone who's going to be coming to work with me a little bit starting in January. And so we were surprised to learn that we each have relationships with you and thought it'd be a good opportunity to kind of share. So one thing that she asked, which I thought was kind of interesting, and it might help us understand this conversation as well, is what's the kind of pathway for you between queenless ants and guinea baboons?
It's a very it's a very complicated. It's not a straight line. It's a lot of detours everywhere.
We don't like straight lines here on the podcast, so that's okay.
So I was when I started my studies, I was very interested in biology. I've always been interested in biology, and I wanted to study the evolution of social behavior, and in particular in insects, ants, bees, wasps. I really wanted to understand how individuals were capable of forming groups, and how evolution would favor the evolution of groups. And I was really going for that. I was super keen. I did my internships on that. And then there was this random thing that happened. I had to take a course because I needed more credits, and I couldn't find anything that I wanted to do. So my wife convinced me to choose cognitive science because she was doing something in cognitive science. I knew nothing about cognitive science. I had no idea whatsoever. So I took cognitive science, and part of it was an internship. And I chose between neuroscience, and I wasn't pretty excited with that. And then there was philosophy. I said, "Oh, let's go for philosophy." And I met Dan Sperber, and I had to do an internship with Dan. And that was a life-changing moment because Dan absolutely convinced me that we could study human behavior, this interaction between biological evolution and cultural evolution, and that understanding this would really benefit from people interested in biological evolution. And so he suggested that I completely change my career and start studying social learning in humans and cultural evolution. And I found this really exciting because at the time, nobody was working on it. So all the things we've been talking about, the work by Andy Whiten on non-human primates, was just coming out. I think it was almost the same year I decided to start working with Dan. So it was really the very, very early beginning. And there was a lot of theories, work by Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson and Cavalli-Sforza and Feldman. And they were biologists interested in modeling cultural evolution. But that also was very small and nobody was looking at it. So it was very exciting. We could feel that there was this very interesting interaction that was going to take place, and I wanted to be a part of it. And by the end of my PhD, they were starting to get studies on non-human primates and social learning. And so I managed to do a postdoc with Andy Whiten. It was the first time I met a monkey. That was very late. I was doing my postdoc. I wasn't introduced to primatology before that. He was kind enough to take me on board with absolutely no experience whatsoever. And I met Valérie, who's now a researcher in the CNRS in Strasbourg. And she taught me everything I know today about non-human primates. I had no idea. She taught me how to train them, how to perform experiments and everything. And that was incredible. I mean, I learned so many things. It was really exciting. And then finally I met Joël Fagot, where I thought, oh my God, all these experiments I've always dreamed about. And that was the start of my current position. So it's a long, winding road through biology, philosophy, and finally psychology and cognitive science. Yes.
Fantastic. I love the in some ways it can kind of look like a pinball bouncing between these really influential people, but along the way it sounds like you've had some really great mentorship as well. And so I wonder, maybe this is not her question, but my question is like, have you tried to kind of sit down and integrate all the ways that these people influenced you and how you kind of take those lessons and apply them in your own lab now? Because it's presumably you also have your own set of students and ways to influence them like they influenced you.
So I found my three mentors were Dan Sperber, Andy Whiten, and Joel Fago, and they're very, very different. They're completely different. And every time it works so well. I learned so much. Different levels that I don't know. I can't separate them. I feel like I'm between the three of them. I'm trying to be. But it's. I think everybody is different. So I think I have my own kind of mentorship. But what I would for people like Melanie who are coming is to get different people, because you learn very different experience. And that's very important, because you see things, from different perspectives, and that opens your mind to a lot of different possibilities. And also, you don't get focused on the same thing. So by the end of your PhD, you have that particular question you're really interested in, and you don't want to see anything else. And then you broaden your mind, and you realize that the world is bigger than that, and you can study many different things. And there are other people who are doing things differently, and they are also interesting. It was for me, that was really important for me.
That's great advice, and you also answered one of her last questions, which is really your advice for students. But I totally agree with that one. And I myself have kind of bounced around a little bit, not only in topics, but also the species. Never studied queenless ants. So that's something you've got on me, but maybe there's still time, right?
There's still time.
So maybe last question from me. You mentioned a little bit earlier on, you're getting excited about some new experiments that you're designing to work on, and have a new student coming in to work on curiosity. I think, staying curious is a part of the theme coming out of the last couple of minutes of this episode. But do you want to just maybe leave us off with what's the deal with curiosity? What's the angle for the studies, and what do we know and not know about? And to be honest, I think I've seen on Twitter some people advertising positions for graduate students to come and study curiosity and species X of primate somewhere in the world. So I wonder if maybe this is something that's emerging now.
I wonder too. I had not realized. I mean, we've wanting to study. So oftentimes people come to me and they ask me, so why are baboons coming in and doing your experiments? It's a food reward. Okay, so they get food, and that's one aspect of it. But I'm convinced it's not the aspect. And I think a lot of it is linked to this sensation that you get when you're actually solving a problem, or managing to find a solution. And that's also one aspect of it. And I think we've always wanted to study this. And this is linked to curiosity. Do you want to explore your environment? Do you want to find new things? And that student came up with this idea of studying curiosity. So maybe it's the right time to do that. I saw also ads after we started. I saw the same ads, studying curiosity is X. So I think it's an interesting aspect to link to social learning, though, because again, to get cultural evolution going, you need innovation and the transmission of innovation. And innovation are going to be based on individuals who are exploring the environment and finding new ways to solve old problems or new problems that they can solve. And that aspect is certainly linked to curiosity. But right now, I don't know what's going to come out of it. I have no idea what we're going to do. I don't have a very clear definition of curiosity or anything. Yeah, we're going to see.
Sounds fascinating. And it made me wonder, have you ever, so you have these baboons are capable of coming to these experimental booths whenever they feel like it. They get the food reward. You assume, or you hypothesize that maybe they get a cognitive reward as well. Mm-hmm. Have you ever allowed the baboons to choose the tasks that they have in front of them? Or are they always kind of set with
No, that's one of the things that we want to do, right? Is to look at what would they choose when they have the choice. Yeah. So we need to teach them that they can choose the task.
Yeah.
and then give them different choices. Do you want to do this task or that task? Are you going to change? Or are you going to stay on the same one? If I give you an easy one versus easy but very boring, I don't know, touch the right square, versus something that is more challenging but also more exciting. Try to solve this problem, memorize this, or find the target in the environment or something like that. So that's the sort of ideas we're going for. I don't know what we're going to do, really.
Yeah, that sounds cool. I was thinking or it just popped into my mind, these studies by Rob Hampton's group about meta memory as well, where the animals have the option to either take a test or kind of phone a friend in a way, or like get a little bit of memory helped if they're not confident in their own abilities. And I wonder if maybe the baboons would have some of that as well. Like if you had a choice in front of them, they may be more interested in some tasks rather than others, but they also may feel more prepared to do some tasks over others as well. And so I wonder what kind of information can come out of that line of experimentation.
I'm curious.
You're curious. Well, and I was very curious. So thank you for satisfying my curiosity here, Nico, on the podcast. Hope to talk to you soon.
Me too. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the PrimateCast. The podcast is hosted and produced by me, Dr. Andrew McIntosh, Senior Scientist for Wildlife Conservation at the Wilder Institute, Calgary Zoo, formerly Associate Professor of Biological Sciences at Kyoto University. Join me for new episodes as often as I can get them out on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Leave a rating or a review of the show to help other listeners find it. Connect with me through our website, theprimatecast.info, or social media on X, Facebook, or Instagram. Feel free to comment, ask questions, suggest future guests, or share whatever else might be on your mind. If you value the show, consider donating or becoming a member. You can do so by visiting theprimatecast.info and clicking on the big yellow Buy Me a Mic button, which takes you to our campaign page. Or you could click on that little heart icon next to the social media links in your podcast player, or on the text link in the show notes. Your support will help cover production costs and is essential to ensure that I can continue to produce quality informational and inspirational interviews with leading figures in the field long into the future.